What if a smile could haunt your dreams forever? Imagine the smile wasn't friendly, it was something monstrous, twisted, lurking in shadows, and it was watching you. Every victim remembered it differently. For some, the smile was wide, stretching far too much, giving their tormentor an inhuman look. Others recalled the eyes empty and cold, like black pits swallowing the world whole. The townsfolk knew something dark was at play, but no one could explain why everyone who saw that smile ended up disappearing. Jace was the first to bring the rumor to his friends. "You know that crazy smile everyone's talking about?" he asked, half joking, half afraid. "They say if you see it, you're marked." They laughed it off, but only a day later, Mia noticed a figure watching her from across the street. As she crossed to confront them, they vanished, but not before flashing her a terrible grin that seared itself into her mind. That night, Mia couldn't sleep. The smile followed her in every shadow, its grin widening in her nightmares until it felt like it was trying to swallow her whole. By morning, she'd barely slept. The next night, the figure returned, closer this time, smiling wider. Jace tried to comfort her, but his jokes faded when he too began seeing the figure in his periphery, just a glimpse before it vanished. Only the smile stayed, vivid and unnatural. Like something carved from shadow, the fear grew like a festering wound, and soon the entire friend group was plagued by the sight. They convened at Mia's house, determined to find out what was happening. As they shared their sightings, a plan emerged: confront the figure, expose the prankster if that's all it was, and finally rid themselves of this nightmare. The following night, they set up traps around Mia's house, hoping to corner the figure. But the smile was smarter than they realized. As they waited in tense silence, each person started hearing faint whispers, voices hissing their deepest fears. Friends turned on each other, driven mad by the visions and sounds only they could hear. The lights flickered out, and they were plunged into darkness. The smile appeared again, floating in the blackness, its teeth sharp, dripping with something wet and dark. And then the torment began. First was Jake. He felt hands clasp around his throat, yet no one was near him. The grip tightened until he heard a sickening snap. He fell to the floor, his eyes wide open in terror, the twisted smile staring back at him even in death. Mia stumbled, her eyes darting around in sheer panic. She saw her own reflection in the mirror, but it wasn't her face. It was her smile, broken, stretched, pulling apart her skin as if her own flesh was tearing under the weight of it. Her reflection began to laugh, a sound that echoed within her mind, driving her deeper into insanity until she clawed at her own face, desperate to rip the smile off. The others weren't spared. They each fell victim to their own twisted fears, trapped in an endless loop of torture that warped reality and dream. For each, the last thing they saw was that monstrous smile, wide, cruel, and unrelenting. As dawn broke, the town was quiet again. No one saw Mia or her friends leave, and no one dared look too long at their own reflections. But for those who did, if they looked hard enough, they could see a smile waiting for them, patient, ever widening, a whisper promising that once you've seen it, it's already too late. The sun had barely risen over the quiet town when others began to notice the eerie silence hanging over Mia's house. Her mother, concerned after unanswered calls, decided to check on her daughter. As she pushed open the door, an overwhelming chill filled the room. The air felt thick, saturated with the stench of something long dead. Her hands trembled as she flicked on the light. The sight in the living room made her scream, a horrified wail that echoed down. They sprawled across the room, contorted in grotesque positions, their faces frozen in terror. Their mouths were twisted into unnatural smiles, eyes wide and staring, as if they'd witnessed something beyond comprehension. The town was shaken to its core, but as the police searched for clues, they uncovered nothing. The bodies were unmarked, yet each corpse bore the same horrific expression. Whispers began to spread of a curse, of something unnatural prowling the town's shadows. Everyone felt it. The smile was still watching, waiting. Days passed, and the town mourned. But not everyone felt safe. Among Mia's classmates, a few had seen the smiling shade from a distance. And now the memory burned like a sickness. A chill would creep down their spines whenever they turned off the lights. They'd glimpse shadows that didn't belong, or hear soft, mocking laughter, even when they were alone. They thought they could ignore it, but the smile was relentless. One night, Ethan, another friend of Mia's, woke up to an eerie silence. The air was still, oppressive, pressing down on him with a force that made it hard to breathe. He sat up, his heart hammering. That's when he saw it, at the foot of his bed, the shade, its smile stretched wide, eyes gleaming in the darkness. Ethan. It whispered, the voice like gravel scraping across metal. I'm going to make you smile. Ethan tried to scream, but the shade was already on him, its face inches from his own. He could feel its cold breath, its grin twisting with malice. The shade's fingers pressed into his cheeks, forcing his mouth to stretch into a painful, grotesque smile. His skin tore as the smile's grip intensified, its nails digging deeper, twisting his face into an expression he couldn't escape. Blood dripped down his chin as his own smile contorted into something inhuman, and the pain became unbearable. The shade leaned close, its voice dripping with cruel delight. Keep smiling. Or I'll make it. A final, brutal twist. The shade wrenched Ethan's head back, and a sickening snap echoed through the room. Ethan's lifeless face was left twisted into a wide, grotesque grin, his eyes empty and staring into nothingness. The next day, Ethan's body was discovered, and panic gripped the town. The fear spread like wildfire, and the few survivors began meeting in secret, hoping to find a way to break the curse. They huddled in abandoned buildings, whispering theories and desperate plans. But the smile was always listening. Olivia, one of the last remaining friends, was relentless in her search for answers. She scoured the town's records and uncovered an old tale of a man who had once been cursed by a witch. Condemned to wander in darkness forever, smiling in eternal suffering. The witch's curse was clear. Any who dared to see his face would join him in torment, their own twisted smiles marking them as his forever. Desperate, Olivia gathered her friends. We have to confront it. It's the only way, she insisted, clutching a flashlight and a knife. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her fear. They decided to meet at the town's abandoned church, hoping the place would offer them some protection. But as soon as they entered, the doors slammed shut, and the air grew frigid. The shadows thickened, gathering in the corners, watching, waiting. Then, from the darkness, the smile appeared. Its face was more hideous than they remembered, a smile stretched impossibly wide, showing teeth sharpened to razors. Its eyes were dark pits, and its voice dripped with malice as it whispered, "Welcome. You're just in time. For the show." The smile moved faster than they expected, appearing behind one of Olivia's friends, Daniel. It grabbed him by the hair, yanking his head back and forcing him to look directly into its face. Daniel's eyes widened in terror as he felt his lips twist into a painful grin. The smile didn't stop there, it drove its fingers into his mouth, pushing his jaws open until the skin around his lips tore, stretching wider and wider. Daniel's screams turned to gurgles as blood filled his mouth, but the smile continued its work, transforming his face into a permanent mask of agony. The others tried to run, but the smile was everywhere, shifting through shadows, appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye. One by one, it caught them, each victim suffering a unique and brutal fate. Sarah was next. It forced her to watch as her own reflection in a cracked mirror twisted and contorted, her face splitting open into a bloody, unnatural grin. She clawed at her eyes, desperate to escape the vision, but the smile's grip was unyielding. Olivia, the last survivor, found herself cornered. She backed away, her heart pounding, as the smile loomed closer, its grin impossibly wide. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. The smile leaned in, its voice a whisper. "Once you see the smile, there's no escape." With a final, agonizing scream, Olivia's face twisted into a permanent grin, her eyes vacant, her body left to rot in the darkness of the abandoned church. Days later, rumors of the smile spread to nearby towns, and soon others began seeing it. The curse carried on, an endless cycle of terror, each victim marked with that same haunting, twisted smile. And somewhere in the shadows, the smiling shade watched, waiting for its next victim, its grin stretching wider as the terror continued. It was said that if you looked in a mirror too long, or lingered in dark places, you might just see it. And town had become a ghost of itself. People moved in silence, avoided mirrors, kept lights on even during the day. They whispered of a curse that spread through sight, infecting all who dared to glimpse it. The sight of a smile, something so simple, so human, had become a death sentence. Alex, a skeptic and aspiring journalist from a nearby city, was drawn to the story like a moth to flame. He'd read the online reports, but dismissed them as mass hysteria or a cruel prank. Determined to get the truth, he ventured to the cursed town, certain he'd expose the legend as a local superstition. He arrived at nightfall, the air thick with tension and whispers of the shade. Townsfolk eyed him with a mixture of fear and pity. as if he were already marked. An older woman grabbed his arm as he passed her on the street. "Don't look too hard in the dark, son," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The Shade's smile is waiting." Alex shook her off, forcing a laugh to calm his nerves. But as he moved on, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of his vision. Almost smiling, he headed to the old church where the last victims were found, armed with only a flashlight and his camera. The building loomed before him, windows shattered and roof sagging as if weighed down by decades of grief. With every creak of the floorboards, his confidence wavered, but he pressed on. Trying to shake off the whispers echoing in his mind, as he stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the flashlight flickered. He aimed it down the aisle, the beam catching something moving in the darkness, just the hint of a figure, face shrouded, smiling. He froze, unable to look away, as the smile widened, stretching far beyond anything human. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The Shade's smile sharpened, its voice a hollow whisper. "I'm everything you fear." Suddenly, the doors slammed shut, trapping him in. His flashlight went dead, plunging him into pitch black. Alex fumbled with his phone's light, breathing heavily as he heard footsteps moving closer, the smile's faint whispers filling his ears. A cold, skeletal hand gripped his shoulder, pulling him back against the rough wood of a pew. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the silence around him. The Shade's face appeared inches from his own, grinning as its icy fingers reached toward his mouth. "You don't believe in me?" it asked, the voice crawling through his mind like poison. Alex tried to break free, but the Shade's grip tightened, forcing his mouth open with its bony fingers. His jaw popped as it was stretched far past its natural limits. Pain shooting up his face and neck. Blood dripped down his chin as the Shade's fingers probed deeper, touching the back of his throat, pulling his mouth wider, almost as if it were reshaping him into its own likeness. "You wanted to see a story?" the Shade whispered, digging its nails into the flesh of his cheeks, splitting the skin. "I'll make you the story." Alex's eyes filled with terror as the Shade's hand slid further into his mouth, stretching, twisting, molding his jaw. His screams were muffled, choked by blood as the Shade's face drew closer, its mouth impossibly wide, mimicking his contorted expression. With a final, horrific twist, the Shade snapped his jaw apart, leaving Alex's face split into a permanent, grotesque smile. Blood poured from the ragged edges of his skin, pooling around him as his body slumped to the floor, lifeless yet still grinning. When Alex's body was discovered the next morning, the town fell into a new wave of terror. Police tried to lock down the area, but it was no use. The Shade's curse was spreading faster than they could contain. Officers assigned to investigate began vanishing, each leaving behind only twisted, grinning corpses as evidence of their horrific deaths. But soon, the Shade's reach extended. Back in the city, Alex's colleagues, friends, even strangers who'd seen his last photo online began reporting strange phenomena. They'd catch glimpses of a grinning face in their reflections, in darkened windows, even in the shadows behind them. And then the real nightmare would begin. The Shade wasted no time once it reached the city. It began by appearing in reflections, just a flicker of a smile in the corner of someone's eye. But those who saw it knew their fate was sealed. As soon as they looked too long, they were marked. Over the next few days, a series of brutal, inexplicable deaths left the city reeling. Each victim was found with the same smile, their bodies twisted in agony. Faces split open in horrific, permanent grins. One night, a group of friends dared each other to confront the Shade, convinced it was some kind of prank. They huddled in one of their apartments, armed with cameras, flashlights, and crucifixes. But the Shade didn't fear their weapons, it thrived on their fear. The lights flickered, the temperature dropped, and in the darkness, the smile appeared. One by one, it claimed them, each death more horrific than the last. The Shade grabbed one friend by the shoulders, forcing her to look into its eyes as it twisted her head around, spinning until the muscles and tendons snapped. Another friend was dragged into a mirror, his reflection shattering as his body seemed to fold inward, disappearing into the glass. In the end, only one remained. He huddled in a corner, whimpering, his flashlight flickering as he watched his friends die in unimaginable ways. The Shade leaned down, its face inches from his own, and whispered, "Smile." With one violent motion, it grabbed his jaw and yanked, twisting his face into a final, ghastly grin that mirrored its own. The Shade's legend spread quickly, becoming an online sensation, a modern-day horror story that people dared each other to repeat, to summon. But those who dared didn't last long. Soon, reports of twisted, smiling corpses spread to every city, each death more brutal than the last. The shade was unstoppable, a curse of fear and violence, a specter whose smile was the last thing its victims ever saw, and as the legend grew, one thing became clear: the more people feared the shade, the stronger it became, but those who dared didn't last long. Soon, reports of twisted, smiling corpses spread to every city, each death more brutal than the last. The shade was unstoppable, a curse of fear and violence, a specter whose smile was the last thing its victims ever saw, and as the legend grew, one thing became clear: the more people feared the shade, the stronger it became. It lurked in shadows, watching, waiting, smiling. And somewhere in the darkness, it whispered, "Once you see the smile, it's already too late." Detective, with a shiver, she glanced toward the window, heart pounding. The street was dark and empty until, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows, its face twisted into a sickeningly wide grin. The shade stared up at her window, the smile stretching impossibly wide, eyes hollow, and glowing with a hunger that sent chills down her spine. She tore her gaze away, but it was too late. The shade had seen her, the lights in her apartment flickered, and Grace could feel its presence closing in. Shadows slithered across the walls, warping and twisting, as if the shade's darkness was swallowing her whole. She backed away, heart racing, but no matter where she turned. The grinning face appeared, distorted in reflections, smirking from the shadows, lurking just beyond her reach. Then, the torture began. The shade's skeletal hand reached out from the darkness, gripping her arm with a strength that felt like ice stabbing through her skin. It twisted her arm back slowly, savoring the way her bones cracked, her tendons stretched. Grace screamed, but the shade's laughter drowned her out, echoing through her mind, filling her head with mocking whispers. Its grin grew wider as it pulled her into the mirror, dragging her through the glass into a twisted, nightmarish reflection of her apartment. Here, the walls were smeared with blood, and faint, ghostly faces watched from every corner. Each of them twisted into the same horrific smile. Grace struggled, but the shade tightened its grip, its face inches from her own. It forced her to stare into its hollow, endless eyes, the darkness within pulling her deeper, filling her with terror she'd never known. "Smile," it whispered, a command that felt like a knife slicing through her mind. The shade's fingers dug into her cheeks, pulling them upward, twisting her face into a grotesque, painful grin. Her skin stretched and tore, blood running down her face as her muscles strained against its unnatural eyes gleamed with sadistic pleasure, feeding off her suffering, her fear, her helplessness. And just when she thought the pain couldn't get worse, the shade's fingers extended like blades, slicing into her mouth, forcing her smile wider, until the corners of her lips split open, blood pooling in her mouth. It held her there, suspended in agony, her body contorted and broken, her smile a mask of horror and pain. Hours later, Grace was found in her apartment, her face frozen in a horrific, bloody grin, eyes wide with terror. Her body was broken, twisted, as if her bones had been shattered from the inside. The sight was too much for even the most seasoned officers. Several of them vomited. Unable to look at the grotesque mockery of a smile that marked her death, and as they investigated, more reports came flooding in. The shade's curse was spreading, claiming victims far and wide. It had become an unstoppable force of terror, a nightmare that hunted down those who dared to believe it was only a myth. In the weeks that followed, whispers of the shade reached every corner of the country. Fear spread like wildfire, and with each story told, each whisper of dread, the shade grew stronger. People were found dead in their homes, on the streets, in places they thought were safe, all of them bearing the same twisted smile, their bodies brutalized in ways that defied explanation. The shade's legend became an obsession, a warning shared among those who feared they might be next. And yet, they couldn't help but look, to wonder, to dare, because once you saw the smile, there was no escaping its wrath. It was always watching, waiting, grinning in the darkness, eager for its next victim, and the last thing they would ever see was that smile with a smile. And somewhere in the darkness, it lingered, watching. The shade's influence spread like a silent plague, an infection of fear leaving a trail of broken, tormented bodies in its wake. Each death was more gruesome than the last, each twisted smile a brutal reminder of its relentless power. And as more people succumbed, the city fell into a dark haze of paranoia, unable to shake the feeling that a simple smile could be their undoing. Cassie was a night shift nurse who had heard the rumors of the shade but dismissed them as urban legends. She believed that fear was for the weak, something she couldn't afford in her line of work. But one night, as she walked home under flickering streetlights, she felt a presence lurking in the shadows. A shiver crawled up her spine as she glanced back. the uneasy feeling intensifying as she noticed an unnatural, wide grin staring at her from across the street. As she hurried her pace, the smile seemed to follow her, vanishing each time she tried to focus on it directly but reappearing in her peripheral vision, lingering, mocking. Her heart raced as she reached her apartment, fumbling with her keys, feeling the shade's gaze bore into her back. Cassie slammed the door shut, locking it behind her, but the tension didn't ease. Her reflection in the mirror caught her eye, and there it was, the shade, grinning over her shoulder, its twisted smile dripping with malice. Before she could scream, her body was thrown against the wall by an invisible force. The shade appeared, looming over her, its smile stretched impossibly wide, shadows clawing at her limbs, pinning her in place. Cassie's eyes darted around, looking for a way out, but there was no escape. Her vision blurred as the shade's fingers extended, pressing into her forehead, invading her mind. Images flooded her consciousness, visions of torture, fear, blood. She saw herself twisted into unnatural, bones snapping as she was forced to smile, the tendons in her face stretching, tearing. The pain was unimaginable, every nerve in her body screaming as the shade controlled her like a puppet, savoring each snap, each slice. It whispered into her mind, its voice a cold, mocking hiss, "Smile for me." Cassie felt her mouth being forced wide, her lips stretching until the skin split, blood pouring down her chin as her face contorted into a hideous, forced grin. Her jaw cracked, dislocating under the pressure, her teeth fracturing one by one as they ground together. The shade's laughter echoed in her mind, its fingers twisting deeper, rooting in her thoughts, drawing out every memory of fear. Every moment of doubt. Her body convulsed, a marionette in the shade's hands, her broken smile frozen in place as she felt her sanity slipping, lost in the endless torment it fed upon. Detective Marcus Collins was assigned to investigate Cassie's murder, though the word murder didn't begin to cover the horror he found. Her body was left in her apartment, posed like a grotesque doll, her face split open in a horrifying grin, her eyes wide with terror. Bloodstains covered the walls, smeared into chaotic symbols that made his stomach churn. But Collins had seen enough in his years as a detective to hold his composure, or so he thought. The longer he investigated, the more he felt something watching him. A chill in the air that clung to his skin, a shadow that crept closer every night, and then, the dreams started. Each night, he saw the shade, its smile hovering over him, its hollow eyes peering into his soul, feasting on his fear. He would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, only to find his reflection grinning back at him, a twisted, blood-stained smile haunting his own face. Each day, his reflection grew more sinister, the grin stretching wider, his eyes sinking deeper. Collins knew he was losing his mind, but he couldn't stop. The shade was implanting seeds of paranoia, twisting every shadow, every sound, into a harbinger of its presence. He became obsessed with stopping it, researching ancient curses, consulting mediums, desperate to find a way out, but the shade didn't want him to escape, it wanted him to suffer. And so, it tormented him, dragging him deeper into a pit of despair. Collins saw visions of his own death in every reflective surface, his body brutalized, his face frozen in that same horrific grin. Finally, one night, Collins broke. He smashed every mirror, shattered every window, anything that could reflect the shade back at him. But it was no use. In the shards of broken glass, the shade's smile appeared. Hovering over him, its fingers reaching out to claim him, Collins's screams filled the apartment as the shade took its time, twisting his limbs, snapping his fingers one by one, forcing his body into a contorted mockery of life. Blood pooled beneath him, his face frozen in an agonized grin as the shade completed its masterpiece, another soul claimed by its endless hunger for fear. In the following weeks, Collins's death became another ghost story, another chilling tale to spread fear through the city. People whispered about the shade, terrified to see their own reflections, to catch a glimpse of that haunting smile in the corner of their vision. The shade thrived, its power growing with each victim. Each tale of terror. And somewhere in the darkness, it waited, smiling, watching, ready to claim anyone who dared to look, to smile, to believe they could escape. The spread of Detective Collins's horrifying end, the city's fear of reflections grew into full-blown hysteria. Mirrors were covered, windows were boarded up, and even pools of water were avoided, anything that might reflect back that twisted grin. Yet, despite every precaution, the shade found a way. No one could evade its sinister reach. Enter Julie, the shade's final target. Julie was a horror blogger who prided herself on debunking urban legends, making a name for herself by seeking out the most disturbing stories and exposing them as myths. When she heard the stories about the shade, she scoffed at the hysteria, convinced it was just a mass psychological trick, a fear that had simply gone viral. But when she saw the twisted smile of the shade in a photo of Detective Collins's crime scene, she felt a chill she'd never known before. Determined to uncover the truth, Julie began to investigate the shade's origins, convinced she could disprove it once and for all. But the deeper she dug, the more she found herself surrounded by darkness, accounts of victims before Collins, centuries-old folktales of an entity that fed on fear, and horrifying sketches depicting a grinning figure that seemed to watch her from every page. Her rational skepticism began to crack, fear creeping in as her reflection in the screen seemed to distort, showing flashes of a twisted, unnatural grin, the shade's first move. One night, after hours of research, Julie glanced at her laptop screen to see her reflection staring back at her, grinning, as if possessed. Her eyes went wide as she scrambled back, heart pounding. She shut the laptop and covered every mirror in her apartment, but it was too late. The shade had chosen her, and it had no intention of leaving. As the nights went on, Julie began to feel its presence lurking around every corner, shadows creeping toward her as she slept, her dreams haunted by that chilling smile. She could hear whispers calling, the shade mocking her, promising that her disbelief would be her undoing. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel it closer, its cold fingers grazing her skin, leaving bruises in the shape of its wicked grin. One night, Julie found herself unable to sleep, her body restless, her heart pounding as the temperature in her apartment dropped. She turned on every light, convinced it would keep the shade at bay, but the light only cast more shadows that twisted into the shape of a grinning face, watching her from every corner. Desperate, she stumbled into her bathroom, turning on the faucet to splash cold water on her face. As she looked up, she saw it, her reflection. Staring back at her, its grin twisted beyond anything human, her own eyes filled with terror. She screamed, but the reflection didn't mimic her. Instead, it leaned forward, grinning wider as its eyes darkened into empty voids. Then, with a jerk, Julie was pulled forward. She felt herself being dragged into the mirror, her body slamming against the glass, her own reflection clawing at her skin from the other side, scratching lines into her face, tearing her mouth into a forced, agonized smile. She tried to pull back, but it was as if her skin was fused to the glass, her face contorting as the shade shaped her into its newest puppet. In the days that followed, Julie was never seen again. But the people who knew her claimed they could feel her presence in mirrors, her screams echoing through their reflections. Her friends, family, and even her blog readers began to feel her fear, her agony, as if her reflection had been cursed, trapped within every mirror the shade inhabited. But the shade's game was far from over. In every mirror, it left remnants of her agony, a face torn by fear and pain, her eyes wide and lifeless, her mouth twisted into that sinister smile. It wasn't content with merely it wanted her suffering to serve as a warning, her reflection haunting others who dared to glance at their own. As weeks passed, the shade's legend grew, and more people reported glimpsing Julie's tortured face staring back at them, her silent screams etched into every reflective surface the shade touched. Each new sighting fueled the shade, feeding its power as it claimed new victims, each one more terrified than the last, each reflection more twisted, more brutal, until the city was drowning in an ocean of fear. And then, one by one, the city's mirrors began to go dark, each covered in black shrouds, hidden behind curtains, buried deep underground. But the shade was patient. It knew that sooner or later, someone would look, that curiosity would get the better of them, and there it would wait, grinning, hungry, ready to claim another soul.